Order. Good morning. Welcome to the Public Accounts Committee meeting for today. We have with us the witness, the Auditor General's office. Would like to ask everyone to place their phones on silent. Today our topic is the Auditor General's report, performance report dated May 29th, 2018. We'll start with introductions, beginning with Mr. Horn.
Good morning, everyone. Bill Horn, MLA for Waverley Fall River Beaverbank. I'm filling in today for Hugh McKay from Chester St. Margaret's.
Good morning, everyone. Appreciate all the great work you've done. And Brendan McGuire, Halifax Atlantic.
Benjamin Jessom representing Hammonds Plains, Lucasville. Good morning.
Good morning, Suzanne Lonis-Croft, MLA Lunenburg.
Gordon Wilson, MLA for Clare Digby.
Good morning, welcome. My name is Tim Houston. I'm the MLA for Pictou East.
Morning, Dave Wilson, MLA for Sackville Cobequid.
And Lisa Roberts, MLA for Halifax Needham. Good morning.
Alan McMaster, MLA for Inverness, and your chair. Mr. Pickup, please introduce yourself and we'll allow your colleagues to introduce themselves.
Good morning, Michael Pickup, Auditor General of Nova Scotia.
Good morning, Andrew Atherton, Assistant Auditor General.
Good morning, Robert Ewer, Audit Principal.
Ashley Richardson, Audit Principal.
Mr. Pickup, you may begin with your opening comments.
Sure, I only have a few opening comments, and firstly I want to thank you for having us here today to talk about the report that was released yesterday. I'm not going to try to summarize those reports. It's been out for a day. I do believe they cover three very important areas where government delivers programs and services to Nova Scotians. Maintenance enforcement program, where there are approximately 14,000 children and plus spouses in the program, so a key aspect of what the government does. Safety and security at corrections, and then rounding out this performance report is the audit of grants, that essentially looks at prudence over spending. So covering three key aspects of some of the things that government does. I want to firstly thank the organizations that we audit, the three departments that were subject to the grants audit, but especially I think I would call out the Department of Justice, where they had two audits in this report, which is a bit unusual to have two in one report. We had excellent cooperation, but I think beyond that, what's most important to me, you know, the audit results are what they are. What's most important now are the responses to the recommendations, the agreement to act, and what happens now. So that's what's critical to me in terms of the cooperation that we have with this department, particularly on the corrections piece, I think, where most of the responses have a fairly fixed timeline that Public Accounts Committee could easily hold the government accountable for in terms of deadlines. So I was pleased to see that, and I want to remind Nova Scotians and remind the committee that all of our recommendations have been agreed to. There is no disagreement with the people we audit or with the government. They completely agree with everything we do. So I want to keep that in mind, that I very much think we're here to serve and to help you in doing your job, help explaining the audit reports to you to the best of our ability. But at the end of the day, you know, auditing standards require us, of course, to clear these reports with the people we audit and clear the facts, and that has all been done, and I think that is very good. Finally, I think I want to very much thank the people in my office, the people with me here today who were responsible for these audits, but also probably equally or more important, and I'm sure these folks would agree, are the people back in our office who do all of this work. Besides us, there are 30-some people who deliver these reports, and without them, this would not be possible. So that was all the opening comments I was going to make, and we'll be happy to take questions.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup, and to your team as well. Mr. Houston of the PC Caucus, you have 20 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you for conducting these audits. They are three areas that I hear a lot about in my constituency office. I often hear from families that aren't receiving the maintenance payments they're supposed to receive as ordered by the courts. I get a lot of questions about the grants structures of the province. And I hear from corrections officers all over the province, and families of inmates as well, about the stressful environment that is in our corrections facilities. And when I see the results of an audit like this, I understand why I'm hearing from all of those constituencies. It's not good. But thank you for doing the work and shining the light on the operations of government and the shortcomings of government where they happen. And I think that the work that you're doing in this committee kind of go hand in hand, and we can bring issues to the forefront and then work for solutions on them. So, but I do see the effort as hand in hand. And your audit of communities, cultures, and heritage examined a period from April 1st, 2015 to March 31st, 2017. But that's the period of the audit, but the audit fieldwork was done obviously after that, and the audit was conducted and finalized on March 14, 2018. I think that was the time that the audit was finalized, right? March 14, 2018.
Mr. Pickup.
Right.
And on February 21st, the Department of Communities, Cultures and Heritage appeared before the Public Accounts Committee. And the topic that day was funding and grants. And that's the same grants that were being audited. So the department was appearing before the committee on February 21st, and they were talking about the same grants that the audit fieldwork from your office was happening. Did you find that department's appearance at the Public Accounts Committee on February 21st, whilst your fieldwork was being conducted actively, did you find that the department's appearance at this committee, before this committee on that day, in any way impeded or influenced your audit?
So firstly, Mr. Chair, if I could correct something. One was a question or comment, and two was my confirmation. It was May 14th, not March 14th. In terms of the date of completion. So just want to correct that. In terms of the appearance before a department, before the committee, if a department gets called before the committee, that really is within the purview of the committee to decide, and it's not for me to make comment on whether the committee should or shouldn't be calling in an organization. Having said that, you know, the departments we audit, the organizations that we audit, we have a relationship with them in terms of auditing standards where they know the confidentiality requirements, they know what they can talk about and not talk about, so they respect that under the Auditor General Act, you know, they wouldn't be talking about draft audit reports or audit findings until they're tabled in the House. I respect that, they respect that, and as long as I've been Auditor General, we have not had any problem, knock on wood, with any leaks or with anything like that coming out. So that really would be my only comments in terms of who appears and when, and in relation to audits.
Okay, thank you. And the same audit of grants and contributions for the three departments included the Department of Agriculture, and again that the audit completed on May 14th, as you say. But on March 7th, the Department of Agriculture appeared before the Public Accounts Committee, and the topic on that particular day was wine development. And a key piece of the government's wine development program that was discussed that very day was the Vineyard Development and Expansion Fund, a fund that is listed in the appendix to your audit of Chapter 1. So it was a fund that was covered as well. Did you find that while you were doing the field work and having the Department of Agriculture here, did that in any way impede your audit, or is the same with communities and cultures? You don't really care who's here. Your audit just goes ahead. They can come to this before this committee at the will of the committee.
So I wouldn't say that I don't care who comes before the Public Accounts Committee. Obviously, I do care. And I would care if somebody commented on a draft audit report or work that was going on, because that would, in fact, be a violation of the confidentiality under the Auditor General Act and under what the departments and us have to follow. So these departments know that, and as long as I've been Auditor General, we haven't had a problem with that line being crossed in terms of discussion at any levels in government of our draft reports. So it wasn't a concern to me because it didn't impact any of that.
So it doesn't impact what you're doing, and there's two situations that happened in the last 2 months where a department appeared before this committee that your office was auditing. So there's no reason that an important issue of public concern couldn't be brought before this committee just because you're going to look at it. I mean, that's clear from these two examples. Of course, I'm thinking about the FOIPOP situation where the government used their majority to say we're not going to bring internal services before this committee to talk about the FOIPOP breach because look, over here the Auditor General is going to look at the topic in the fullness of time anyway. I think that happened to this committee before. And this committee wanted to speak to the IWK about the expense issue. And the government used their majority to hide behind the Auditor General and say, well, the Auditor General's looking, there's no reason for this committee. That report, I don't think has come out yet, has it? It's been over a year. Is the IWK expense thing, when did that, what was it took over a year to get it done.
So the IWK report will be tabled this fall.
We still don't have it. That's the point. Is this committee should not be used for political cover. So it's being used for political cover in the situation of the FOIPOP breach. It has been used for political cover in the experience of the IWK report, and it shouldn't be that way. When we have a situation with this report today, and I can get into the details, and it's been in the press, the people know what was released in this report, and I can ask you questions today, and most of the questions will be referred back to the department, and the departments can't be brought before this committee realistically, even with the cooperation of the government and their majority, can't be brought before this committee probably until November, even later. So I get concerned when I see the government try to use your office for what I feel is political cover. I'm sure you'd be concerned by that as well. You'd like to see these departments come before the committee, I can imagine, and answer questions directly to them. That would probably be the next natural process you would see from this report, would it not be?
So I think my line on that would be, as it always is, I would hope as we do this work and we report to the House that the Public Accounts Committee is a key tool, a key aspect of accountability. And I've always encouraged in a respectful way that I would hope the Public Accounts Committee calls in each of our chapters. I think if you go back over time, I mean, I said that at the time of the Amanda audit, and I think, you know, the Public Accounts Committee can look to see, did you call in the Amanda audit? Was that on the agenda after our reporting to come before the committee? And I think you can go back and look at a number of our reports that weren't in fact called before the Public Accounts Committee, and I only say that as a fact and as an observation, not as a judgment. That is up to you as a committee, and I respect that's how it works. But I can give you a number of examples, I think, where the Public Accounts Committee didn't call in our work. So talking about calling in work that we're doing, I think is one aspect. Calling in work and chapters that we have done and getting the departments in to talk about it, I think is another aspect of that. So obviously, as the Auditor General, I would be happy if you called in each of the organizations where we are doing audits. In this case, I think with justice, I think it may be worthwhile for everybody, and I say this with all due respect, respecting on the Auditor General, not an agenda-setting part of Public Accounts Committee, but I think the Department of Justice, the Deputy Minister, should come sooner rather than later to talk about these two audits. And I think part of that is, and I've said that to her, and I said, I hope you get before the Public Accounts Committee, I think, to be able to talk about the progress and what is happening since we did these audits.
Thank you for that. I do appreciate that, and I think we should bring them in sooner rather than later as well. And I think we have a couple open spots in June that maybe the majority of the committee might offer to do that and bring them in. But in terms of where we are today with these egregious findings across 3 areas of government, would you say, when you think about the findings of the corrections audit and the fact that the recommendations were accepted, and are you aware of any of the recommendations being acted on right away? I mean, historically, the rate of acceptance of Auditor General's findings is very high, probably 100%. People always say, "Yeah, you're right, we'll do that." But the actual implementation rate of those findings is not 100%. I think it's creeping up. It might be in the 70s now, but it's not 100%. So, as we sit here today, do you have any evidence, or would you have any reason to have any evidence to believe that our corrections facilities are safer today? Because, look, they've already took immediate action and acted on any of their recommendations. Would there be any that you would have the ability to say have actually been implemented already? Acceptance is one thing, implementation is another.
So, as an auditor, I wouldn't be able to provide you with any assurance in terms of what has happened with the responses to the recommendations, and I think I would go back to what I said. That's why I think I would encourage, with all due respect, a timely appearance by the deputy so that she could talk to what has happened in terms of the responses that they gave.
Okay, thank you. In terms of maintenance enforcement, you mentioned in your report that the consolidation of jobs in New Waterford caused a bit of chaos in the unit. But it's been 5 or 6 years since that happened. So in those 5 or 6 years, has the unit managed to return to any sense of normalcy, or is the chaos still ensuing 5 or 6 years after the transition?
So what we are looking at is an audit period that ended at the end of September in terms of the field testing period of time. So I will speak to sort of the conclusions that we made as a result of that work, which is not that long ago. At the end of the day, we have a lot of findings there. There's over $60 million remaining in outstanding payments, and nobody is suggesting that that number is where it should be, and none of the responses from the government would suggest that they're comfortable. In fact, it's the opposite, that they want to lower that number. So I would speak to specifics in terms of the findings and saying they were relevant, through fall and winter when we were clearing this audit, keeping the responses separate because we don't audit the responses. But in terms of, the staffing issues that we found, in terms of the monitoring that we found, I would say, in fairness to the department, though, I mean, there were signs in there, and we mentioned it in the report around the performance management stuff, where there were signs of positive things happening in terms of the development of a performance management framework with targets. But at the audit point, it was too early days to say what would happen as a result of that. But I do want to mention that because that can be lost.
Thank you. Maintenance payments presumably are mostly monthly.
Mr. Jewer, for the record, I'll ask you to respond.
Yes.
Okay, so caseloads were 330 to 450 per worker. So with monthly maintenance payments, that's 22 cases per day, roughly. Any sense of what the optimal caseload should be? 22 is obviously too high by any standard. I can't imagine. But was there any sense of did the staff say what a reasonable caseload might be?
Mr. Jewar?
Staff didn't indicate exactly what they felt a reasonable caseload would be, and it's not something we didn't try and determine that either.
Is there, of the caseload of 330 to 450, is there some that wouldn't really require any staff intervention, that wouldn't require any monitoring? I guess those would be the trouble-free ones.
Mr. Pickup?
One of the, I mean, it would vary, I'm sure, in terms of the nature of the cases, but one of the points that we made in here is that very often, and it's probably understandable, very often, and there's a downside to this, what happens is the files that get attention are the ones that make a lot of noise. It's the people who are calling. And keep in mind that from 2016 to 2018, during the audit period, or over a 3-year period, the number of contacts with, people who are paying, people who are receiving the client contacts doubled from 24,000 contacts to 48,000 contacts. So you got people who are dealing with 330 to 450 case files, and they're dealing with close to 50,000 contacts. So you can imagine what that is like. Related to that caseload, I think what is important, and we mentioned this, is then however many cases people are managing, whatever that optimal number is, what's important is how that gets reported up to the supervisors. And what we found was there were so many reports that management was overwhelmed, and they essentially weren't doing anything with the reports because there was just too much. And then the staff indicated that they never received feedback to say, well, you gave us these reports, do this differently or do that differently, or we should talk about this, or you need coaching here. So I think keeping in mind whatever an optimal number might be, if there is such a thing, that what is key is that supervision, management, coaching, whatever word you want to use for that, of the people who are doing probably a very difficult job with a lot of files.
So the government made some changes, I think, to maintenance enforcement, or allocated some budget to it. I think over the was it last year's budget that they allocated some additional funding? I wouldn't know any indication that really got the job done. I guess it didn't. If we're still seeing so many cases that aren't even being looked at, in spite of being in arrears.
So I think we can really only stick to sort of the findings that we had during the audit, and these issues in terms of the files we looked at, the 21 of 25 cases where there wasn't timely or appropriate enforcement action. That was during a relatively recent audit period. Now, but in fairness, again, I do want to mention that there were signs at the end of things being put in place, but it was too early and it wasn't part of the audit period to be able to see what will shake out of that.
Is there some point in time where a maintenance order that hasn't been paid becomes kind of unrecoverable, legally unrecoverable, I guess? Like, can you be a deadbeat long enough that you just don't have to pay? So
what we talk about in the report is, if you look at the total outstanding payments, is that number of 60 million that we hear about. Oh, it's over 60, but that. Then there's something called inactive cases, and that's around 15 million of inactives, and those are people who, for various reasons, they could be incarcerated, there could be other reasons that they are sitting in this pile of inactives. But we do say just because somebody is in an active at a period of time, that doesn't mean there shouldn't be anything done with those in the future. So there's nothing that they call sort of write-offs, if you will. And in fact, I guess if you're owed money from that inactive group, you still want your money.
I would think you do, yeah. Just have a question on the grants before. So in 1.19, you mentioned that there were certain payments for grants and stuff that were made because they needed to be issued by the fiscal year end. Is that a legitimate reason to issue a check, because it has to get out before the fiscal year end?
Question is being posed to Ms. Richardson.
Either Mr. Pickup or Ms. Richardson.
Okay, I'll take that.
Mr. Pickup.
Okay, so in what we said was, obviously that doesn't match the terms and conditions and reduces accountability. So when these things happen, I mean, there's no other way around that other than, no, that shouldn't happen. And that's a fix-up that needs to occur.
Thank you.
Thank you. The time for questions has expired. We'll move to the NDP Caucus. Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much. I'm going to be focusing my questions, at least for the next little bit, on correctional facilities. Remind me again, the testing period when you were actually out looking at processes and procedures and performance in our provincial correctional facilities, that concluded in February 2017, is that correct?
Mr. Jewer?
Yes, that's correct.
Just Mike didn't quite come on there in time.
Yes, that's correct.
Thank you.
Can you comment at all on why it seems to have taken longer to get the result of this audit released? You know, there was more than a year time span between that testing period and now, whereas clearly with maintenance enforcement it was shorter. So can you just comment on why that is?
Mr. Pickup.
Thank you. Sure. Two points without turning this into an audit course. So that period of testing that ends at the end of February, for example, that doesn't mean we finished our work at that point. That is sort of where we drew files from, is that period. So that work can extend, go into 6 months, if you will. So there was that point. But I will say the correctional facilities audit was different, and there is a longer time period in there because we were initially hoping to complete this audit for the fall of last year, but because we had so many weaknesses and findings, if you will, because you're seeing a report that's the end stage. So all the work that happened before this in terms of clearing facts, going through all of our testing, took so much time because we had so many findings and they were so significant that essentially it took a lot longer than we had planned, which is fine. That's due audit process. But that's what resulted in 12 recommendations, which are probably the most of any of the reports I've had as Auditor General.
So there's significant work to do. Now, in the meantime, last spring there were a number of policy changes that the corrections put into place. Should we interpret that as being a response to to some of the issues that were made apparent in the process of the testing period?
I think I would go back. I won't try to do a line by line on that, but I think if I go back to the responses to the recommendations that we did give, most of those, to the credit of the department, most of those responses have timelines around them, and all the timelines tend to be forward-looking, so they're 2018, 2019. So having said that, I think most of this work is not yet complete, given the responses that the department made, reminding you that we haven't audited the responses.
Right. Okay. So to talk about closed confinement, that is an area where our caucus has been trying to get more information and transparency from the government for some time. And it's concerning that in 9 of the 47 cases examined by the Auditor General, offenders were placed or held in close confinement longer than allowed without the approval required under department policy. And there was also missing documentation to explain why confinement was needed or continued for 5 of the 47 cases. And department policy does not require documentation from healthcare staff confirming confinement is needed for medical reasons or when confinement can end. Without proper documentation, could medical reasons be used inappropriately to justify extended periods of confinement for offenders?
So I think this is a classic case where we are auditing the policies that an organization had in place without commenting on what we think of those policies, obviously. So in this case, the policies were relatively clear as to what should be done. So I think given that they weren't done, and those policies are generally put in place to meet control objectives in order to manage risk, that not having those policies actually working effectively is an issue. So beyond that, all I can say is, you know, if you have a policy that you think should be working, if that policy is not always operating effectively, with that goes the risk of things not working the way you want them to work, and your control objectives not being met. Beyond that, you know, I really can't comment other than on the findings.
Okay. Maybe Mr. Dewar could help to inform me about the definition of administrative close confinement. I know that medical leave is one of the definitions of close confinement. What else would be an administrative close confinement?
Mr. Dewar.
It could be a number of reasons. It could be if an offender may ask to be placed, to be segregated from the rest of the population. Facility management may feel that confinement is needed to protect the individual or protect the security of the facility. It's usually a management decision.
Okay. I'm very aware that this whole chapter would be very different looking at the same material if it were done with a human rights lens as opposed to an Auditor General's lens of, you know, comparing policy, comparing the actual carrying out of established policy versus looking at it through, you know, is this meeting the human rights of the offenders or of people in our corrections facilities, because we know in fact that the majority of them are actually remand population, which means that they ought not even to be called at this point offenders because they haven't actually been through the court of law. Given the seriousness of these issues and court decisions we've seen from other parts of the country, do you think it's time for an independent review of the use of closed confinement in correctional facilities in Nova Scotia?
Mr. Pickup?
I did want to mention one thing in terms of looking at the application of policies. So what an organization, in this case corrections, define as a significant policy, then us looking at how effectively those policies are implemented may include aspects of what you may be referring to. And I draw your attention to paragraph 2.46 on page 41, where we indicate that for 35 of the 47 cases tested on close confinement, the facilities had no documentation to show that the offender was offered time for showers and recreation, or indicated it was offered on some days but not others. And then we talk about sort of that 30 minutes a day of outdoor recreation, time to access showers, not providing these could place reduced stress. So it really is looking at what an organization has defined as some of its key policies, not what we have defined. So when we set the audit objectives, you know, we're staying within our mandate, if you will, in terms of what we're looking at in terms of performance on an audit. So in this case, we did this part of it because it was a key policy or a key aspect of what the department itself had in place.
Thank you. I appreciate that clarification. And yes, that is a very concerning finding. Training is essential for the safety of staff and officers. Staff and offenders. And again, I kind of hesitate at using that word offenders for the prison population, the correctional facility population. But you found in this audit that many staff have not completed required courses. In particular, the Understanding and Responding to Mental Illness course was stopped in 2014, and a replacement course was not ready until February 2017. I know department management have stated its goal is to deliver this training to all correctional officers by 2020. But I believe your conclusion is that taking 2 years to train all correctional officers does not seem reasonable. Did the department provide any rationale for this delay in all correctional officers doing that training?
So 2 points on that. We do draw attention to that, but I would make one clarification. One, I can't add as to why it's going to take to 2020 to get this. It would be speculation on my part, but I think it's a fair question for the department. I think the other fair question is why did they get rid of the first course in 2014 if they didn't have a replacement course up and running until February of 17? And I don't know the answer to that, but I think it's a really good question with all due respect. If and when you have the department here, to ask them why did they get rid of the course and why it takes so long to get the new one and why it's going to take to 2020 to train the rest of the folks.
Can you provide any further details about the reasons behind staff not having completed courses that are required?
Sure. So I think in terms of explaining, I mean, obviously, the people who are running these organizations are the people, our management who are running the organizations, and decisions they make as to what is happening or not and whether they know what is happening is really up to them. So we've made no attempt, and nor was one put forward, I guess, in terms of any rationalization or explanation as to why these things weren't being done. So I won't make any conjecture and would encourage you, I think, to engage in a discussion with the department as to why these things weren't being done, and I think then more importantly what they're going to do from here forward.
How many courses are actually required for new correctional officers?
Mr. Jewar.
I don't have an exact number. We looked at approximately 15 courses that new hires were required to take for each of the samples we looked at. But an exact number, no. We focused on ones that we felt were a little bit more, the ones that jumped out as being kind of more significant.
I do want to, two things hold with me on that. On the new hires. For the officers, for example, 80% of the samples we looked at, they didn't have the required training. It's not us who's determining what the training should be. It's the department itself. They've said this training is important. You have 80% of people who aren't taking it. The other number that sticks with me on this is 50% of those new officers that have been hired that we tested had 3 to 5 courses outstanding. So it's not just one course. And then if you look at the non-officers, which are equally important, I mean, these are social workers, these are people working in the kitchen. 90% of the people we looked at had courses that were missing. So those, I think those tell us something in terms of work to be done.
To switch from training to the hiring process, the hiring process for correctional officers includes an interview, written test, physical fitness test, background checks, which include criminal record, child abuse registry, vulnerable sector, and reference checks, along with a pre-employment questionnaire. And for the sample of 20 correctional officers selected, you found that several steps in the hiring process had not been completed. For example, one or more of either the vulnerable sector, child abuse registry, or criminal record check was missing for 13 officers. Certainly in the discussion in our office, where so many of us are women with relatively young children, the comment was made that we couldn't volunteer at our kids' school with that missing paperwork. Can you explain how such a critical step, or did you get an adequate explanation for how such a critical step in the hiring process was missed?
One, it's difficult, I think, for us, as it is for you by the sounds of it, to understand how that cannot be done. So no, there is no good explanation put forward, and I don't think there was any attempt by the department to rationalize this or to put it onto anything specific. It was acceptance that this is, this shouldn't be happening. And just to go back to your point, of the 20 we looked at of the new hires, 3/4 of those for the officers, if you will, there were steps missing. And that could be a written test, that could be a background check. And again, it's not us who are saying these are the things that should happen, it's the department itself. So this is very much, are you doing what you said you're doing type of audit. The non-officers, equally troubling, because half of the hirings had issues, or at least one issue. So it's not just the officers that are coming in, it's the non-officers as well.
I'm going to move for a second to the policies regarding volunteers, where there appeared to be, according to 2.33, inconsistent application of policies around screening volunteers in correctional facilities, you know, for some of those same requirements, criminal records checks and so forth. And I guess I have a bit of concern that particular recommendation, 2.6, that the Department of Justice should develop and implement a consistent volunteer policy that requires comprehensive screening of volunteers before they are permitted within correctional facilities, and should outline the required background checks and required frequency for updates. That is actually one of the recommendations with a shortest timeline for implementation, versus some of the other recommendations which actually require some of that same rigor to be applied to staff. Do you have any, and I guess part of my concern is that I know from my work at a constituency level that, in fact, there's an important role for volunteer organizations, including for peers who may actually have criminal records and have returned and reintegrated into community and have got themselves on another path, to actually be able to have contact with people who are currently in the correctional system, to support people trying to make similar changes in their own lives. Do you have any concerns or anything to comment on that recommendation or that approach, what you would be looking for in an adequate approach to screening and monitoring volunteers?
Sure. So I think the first part of that, in terms of screening and monitoring, is for the organization to decide what do they want the policy to be. So if the policy is something like do the background checks, do the screening, so that you know what you face, and then you make a decision based on what you face, right? You know, there may be organizations who, here's the result of the screening that we did, we accept you know, what comes with this, or we don't accept, but that is actual management of something versus not doing those checks, so you don't know what you're dealing with, right? So I think what would be adequate in terms of that policy is the first step, saying what you want to get in terms of information, getting that information, and then having some criteria to say, what do you accept, not accept, in what circumstances, and then making sure that control like that is operating effectively. You know, the volunteers that we looked at, we picked 20 samples. 2 of the 20 didn't have a criminal record check. Well, as a starting point, the policy says you get a criminal record check, and then you assess the results of that in terms of what you do with the results of that. But if you don't have that information to start with, then you miss the starting point, right?
And so to clarify, for both in the case of volunteers and in the case of staff, is there a clear policy in terms of what is acceptable on a criminal record check? I mean, I remember hiring someone who had a criminal record, and it was, you know, it was for a DUI 5 years ago, and I decided as an executive director that, you know, that was acceptable given the job you know, before him. Is there actually a clear policy now, either for correctional officers who are newly hired or for volunteers, in terms of what is acceptable on that criminal records check?
So we stopped at the first gate, if you will, in terms of whether this was being done. So in terms of how they then apply that information, in terms of what they accept and where and how and when, I think is up to the department to explain. I will note, though, that somewhat related is we sort of found a variation in the updates. Right? I mean, some of the facilities were updating every 2 to 3 years in terms of the background checks. Others weren't doing it at all when they all report up to the same department. So I think beyond that, probably better the department to respond to.
Okay. Sorry, where would you like to see our correctional facilities move most aggressively, given the 12 different recommendations that came out of this audit and the scope of the work? I don't know if you can comment on the timing for these different recommendations, all of which have been accepted, but what would you like to see when you do a follow-up audit?
So I think our typical practice, as you know, is to wait 2 years to do a follow-up. I would hope in this case, given the responses and the timelines, that the action on all of these takes place more quickly. And I really hope the Public Accounts Committee has a chance to engage in that discussion with the department.
I'm sorry, time has expired. We'll move to the Liberal Caucus. Mr. Gordon Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And welcome. It's always good to see you folks here. I know that there's been inferences made that the AG is always, concerning to have come for public accounts. No, that's not the case whatsoever. I think what you bring and your team bring in the transparency, the unbiased opinions that you bring are very much valued here. And I personally would like to see you here more often. Get that on the record. So we do value what you bring here. I think what concerns me sometimes is comments made certainly by my colleague from Pictou East that politics come into play with the operations of your office, or politics come into the play. This committee is supposed to be if any of all the committees, a nonpartisan, work together to try to get to the bottom of how we can make government work better. And that's ultimately what your job is. And, I'm very pleased to see that in regards to this report that you've brought forward, the ministers, all of the ministers of all the departments, that their responses have been very positive, very quick, and very clear that they accept them. And I think you said that you were very pleased to see that quickness of a response. Just a couple of questions in regards to departments appearing before public accounts. I do believe that everybody understands that there is an agenda-setting process that we do follow here, and we try to be, as open and as flexible as can be. So when agenda items are brought before the committee, we have a subcommittee meeting, and we have an open session we do. You noted that all of the audits that are ongoing are up on your website, so you're very aware of those audits that are going on. We're very aware of those audits that are going on, and there's multiple departments right across government that are being audited at any one time. In regards to that, I would really like to know what your feelings are as far as a department, through our agenda setting process coming in here. That doesn't affect those annual audits that you're doing at any one time, from my understanding.
Mr. Pickup.
Oh, to date, I haven't had any concerns during my time as Auditor General, and I go back to sort of the first year I came here during the Blue Nose. I think the then clerk, previous Deputy Darrow, appeared, I think, before Public Accounts Committee. Now, he was very respectful, and I haven't had any concerns about any of the folks that appeared here talking about our audit work, because they realize, they don't speak for us, and also we don't do it, and they don't do it to talk about ongoing audits in terms of progress of the work.
Right. And I will, because I'm sure my colleague has already mentioned it, in regards to internal services and the security breach. It's been discussed here multiple times to come in here. We do know, and we're, quite pleased that you are acting upon the request that we had to do an audit on that. We are anxious to hear that audit as soon as possible, and we do feel very strongly that depending on the outcome, I mean, I'd like to know the outcome of that audit also. I think we're all kind of anxious to see that will raise the question again of having that department coming in here, and we're not, it's not that we're not supportive of having that department come in here, but we do feel very strongly that, that you should give us the results of that report. I think that will be a very good foundational piece of information to then go forward and see if it warrants having them in here or not. We'll see when that comes. So I know you've been asked in the past your opinion on that, but I'd like to know myself personally, does that sound like a reasonable way to deal with this exceptional request that you had by government to audit an activity in a department?
So a couple of points on that. One, of course, as you've heard me say before, and I say it always with, and I mean it, with all due respect, recognizing my position as an independent auditor, nothing to do with Public Accounts Committee in terms of agenda setting, but I always hope that our audit reports get called to Public Accounts Committee to have a good discussion about the movement forward and the results of our audit. So I will always be on record as encouraging you to, the committee, to call in each of the audits. Having said that, you know, I think it's very much up to the committee as to what they're trying to achieve and who they think the witnesses they need. Obviously, if it's to talk about one of our audits or what our thoughts are, our conclusions are, you know, you have to wait until we table the audit report. I mean, that's the way the Auditor General Act works. That's the legislation we have. There's audit standards that I follow. And just, if I could comment, audits take a long time. I get that. You know, and part of our credibility comes from the fact that when we do audits, we get it right. Right? 99% of our recommendations are agreed to, and 75% of our recommendations have been implemented, the highest ever. That's because I know that we are getting it right, because I'm a CPA, as are all the folks with me. We are following auditing standards that require we plan, execute, and report audits. So yes, they take time, and we don't do audits in a month. So I do want to go on the record as having said that, and some Auditor General offices and audits typically take 18 months. So it's not unusual for us to take a year or more, and keeping in mind, you know, we're 35 people, we're putting out a lot of reports, and we're auditing financial statements. I don't say that to be defensive. I say it to own the fact that audits take a long time to do.
Thank you, and I agree with you that you do them in a very professional way. That I didn't know it was 99%. I didn't know that you had 1% wrong. I'd be interested in knowing what that 1% is. But and I am pleased again for you to reflect the fact that some of the highest numbers of responses to your recommendations, 75%, this government is acting upon, and I'm quite proud of that fact also. So the fact that politics is playing into your office, I dismiss that myself personally. I'd like to just start off with the grants. I am curious about in the report there was talk about grant inspections and talk about accountability and knowing that money was spent and it got value for Nova Scotians. I guess this is as simple as I could phrase it. And we looked at a broad spectrum of grants. I'm assuming you looked at them right from housing grants right straight through. There were some with community culture, or there were some with CCH. I never get to delve right down into the details of it, but can you just first off give me an idea of the scope of those grants?
Mr. Pickup.
Sure. So if we refer to Appendix 2 on page 26, we've identified sort of the scope. So essentially over a 2-year period, we looked at about $45 million in grant programs, and that covered agriculture, communities, natural resources. But I think more importantly, we covered 18 different programs because we tried to get broad coverage. Within those 18 programs, we did 170 specific grants in terms of what we we looked at. So I think it's fair to say fairly broad coverage if you look at, and that was our purpose, that was our objective, was to cover all of these sort of smaller pots of money that add up to $45 million over a 2-year period.
Okay, thank you.
I hope that helps.
In your audit, would you have actually reached out to the community groups that received these in any way to sort of see, to validate, potentially what impact it might have had?
So, and Ms. Richardson can add or / correct me if she wishes, but no, this was very much audits within the departments, partially because what was important to us is that documentation or consideration, if you will, because it's more than documentation, a consideration of the value received, did you get what you had hoped to get out of this, really should happen within the departments so that they can make decisions on future spending to say, okay, this is working the way we want. This one we want to reallocate. So it was no. The quick answer was no. We didn't reach out to the organizations who received the money. We looked at what the department did and their oversight and evaluation of the people who received the money. Fair?
Okay. Fair. Thank you. Just move on to the maintenance enforcement. I noted that you had reported that there was approximately $60 million owed in maintenance enforcement over the duration of the program. I did get a chance to find out that the program did begin January 1996. So when you went back 7 years ago and picked up the start of those numbers, you don't know what the actual dollar value was that was owed then versus what is owed now, would you?
So no, we only picked up at 2011, partially because our focus was on what that number is today.
So I'm curious though, when you started in 2011, do you know what the actual amount was that was owed at that point in time?
In 2011, yes, we have that in our table on page 57. That outlines what the number was in 2011. So it was just under. It was over 60, under 65 million. So. It's on page 57 in the table. So
okay, in page 57. So then the amount that was owed in 2011 was $60 million.
It was over 60. It was
over 60.
Getting close to 64, I would say.
Okay. So this amount of money, do you know what amount of the money owed previous to 2011 was actually collectible? I'm curious. I'm not sure, but I believe some of the money may have been owed by people that were deceased, possibly. Or do you have any kind of a breakdown, or was that just a figure that was just pulled out?
So I don't have a breakdown, but I know we don't use that word on collectible. In paragraph 3.2 on page 55, we talk about of the amount that is owed, the department class is 15 million of it as associated with inactive accounts. So they use the term inactives, where they're not currently enforcing due to a payer situation. So somebody could be incarcerated, for example, and they may be put in that inactive pile, but they're not using the term uncollectible.
Okay, and I know it's maybe kind of hard to articulate or to measure. But in regards to the maintenance enforcement program, do you know, is there any way to articulate the value of how much it was impacted when it was moved to New Waterford? I know there was a bit of a graph in there. Mm-hmm. Is there any way to ascertain how big a hit we took here, or the people that are impacted by that program, by that move in dollars?
Sure. So after the move to New Waterford, and it's always, somewhat of a challenge / caution when you attribute things that happen or at the same time to the direct impacts to say this was related to this was related to that. But what we do know is after the move to New Waterford, that the numbers jumped up in 2014 to about 70 million, and then in 2015 it jumped up to 73 million, and now it's back around, you know, something over 60, in the range of 63 million. So at the time of the move to New Waterford, a big increase, right, in the amount of outstanding payments.
I know myself, I remember, because being elected in 2013, certainly I had people coming to my doors, same as others, concerned about getting access to their maintenance enforcement, or maintenance, and it was, I believe, one of the prime things that we worked on, and I think we worked on it very hard to fix. And I think there's been some very positive movement. I know for fiscal 2017-18, you know, we saw an increase of 422% in liens that were put against individuals. We saw a 122% increase in federal license denials. We saw a 72% increase in motor vehicle inspections, and we saw an 18% increase in referrals to public safety investigations. So I think the trend is starting to change. I do know that this is I've learned an awful lot about collecting. It is a national problem, and I'm quite proud of the fact that we have made it a national problem. It has been discussed at the all premiers table by our premier, and just recently, I believe it was, let me think, it was probably just a few months ago, March 29th, when the proclamation happened that allowed us to put into place the legislation that was brought forward. Do you have any idea of what impact that new legislation is going to have going forward? I know the Auditor General always looks at a current point in time, but sometimes you do look outward too. Was there any work done to look outward on how positive that impact is going to be for the province?
I think the only outward looking that we did in this audit is on page 63, we sort of summarize it to say, you know, all of these actions, if you will, the things you're talking about, the other things that they want to do, you know, we do know that management is setting goals for the programs, and there are positive signs of performance, you know, management being set up, indicators being set up, the identification of goals, because any of these things you do, obviously, you want it to, at the end of the day, to impact that big number, and you hope the 60 million will become a much lower number, right? So I think the positive signs that we were, to the extent we were able to talk to them, was on the performance management area on page 63, which is the setup. So I really hope now what will happen is that stuff on page 63 in terms of the performance management that's getting set up now happens and has an impact, so that 60 million becomes much lower.
Yes, thank you. So, you know, in one area I think that ties in there is the staff training, and I mean certainly that's a big part of it. And I know there were improvements done also around the technology and maintenance enforcement program to help free up time for the staff to be able to improve the processes for families. Can you do you have any idea on the impact that implementation of improvements had on staff's ability? Did you see anything when you did your audit to show results there?
So I can only really speak to what we saw in terms of the testing. So when we look at enforcement actions, for example, but, you know, I do want to draw on the point again that, you know, the systems work to the extent that the systems are operating effectively. So this electronic system has, you know, what we used to call at one time a BF function, a bring forward function, where a file would automatically be called to come up, right? And that wasn't being used in the system they had. So So we didn't, to go to directly to your point, you know, I can't comment directly on any particular initiative having an impact other than to say, you know, the results are what they are in terms of everything that was done and everything that wasn't being done. Here were the results of the testing from all of that.
Yeah. Thank you. Yes, and again, I'm looking at a different window than I think you were looking at, going back to 1960, 68, 69. I'm looking at, you know, what I'm hearing and seeing people coming into my office. So the impact of allowing staff to revoke or suspend or prohibit the renewal of driver's license and vehicle permits, which was brought in, and improving the flow of information to the court system between people within the program, simplifying the process of dealing with payments that have gone unclaimed, and the transferring of administrative fees that are owed to Service Nova Scotia for collection. These are major, major fundamental changes in that program, probably some of the biggest changes I think we've seen in decades to improve the system. Especially climbing out of the hole that we were in 2011 that was created. I just, again, I'm curious, and I wish that there was a way that those factors could have been taken into your audit and looked at as what does that mean down the road. So I only leave it with you with that as a way of trying to bring it into focus more of what ultimately the impact on maintenance enforcement is going to be in this province. I know my time is almost out. I do want to say, though, that this committee meets more than any other committee in Canada. We sit six.
Time has expired. We'll move to the PC Caucus. The second round will be for 15 minutes. Mr. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I would like to expand on my colleagues' comments. I will just kind of put my colleagues here on notice that at the end I will make a motion that we have an empty date, I think June 13th, and another one June 27th, and then some dates in July. I will be making a motion that we bring these three departments in to fill those dates. So just a little heads up for my colleagues there. But in terms of the corrections audit, you've said that this audit of the corrections facilities has resulted in more recommendations than any audit that you've previously conducted. That should speak to the state of things that you discovered when you did your audit. So, and some of the recommendations, I mean, I was looking, there's recommendations here. Ensure COs complete all required training. Complete all steps in the hiring process. Complete performance evaluations. Like, this is the type of recommendations we have to make to the most senior people in government. It just seems so hopeless that we need the Auditor General to come in and tell people to do these basic steps. So when you discover that type of those types of things, how do you characterize the oversight in the department, really? How do you characterize the oversight in the department when these are the types of recommendations you have to tell the most senior people in government?
Mr. Pickup.
So I would agree firstly that, I mean, many of these things I think are basic functions. If you look at the, human resource management, I mean, ultimately, in our system, you put it on the minister who's accountable, and then you look to the, beyond that, you look to the deputy minister to say, in terms of leadership, why are these things happening? And I think I can't answer to the why, and how did these things happen, and, why did it take an audit for this stuff in many cases to be made clear. I mean, I won't attempt to speak for the deputy in answering that. So I think it was somewhat dismaying, if you will, to see this many things that seem so basic that aren't happening. I think particularly in an environment, because human resource management should work well in any organization, and while I would say it's very important in an audit office, it's likely even more important, I might argue, in a correctional facility where safety and security are so important. So, yes, the number of recommendations and the nature of them, I was sort of left scratching my head as to the why.
I mean, I join you in that head scratching, because when I see, we have the human resource side and we have the operations side and recommendation. Complete required rounds and searches. I mean, really, that's where we're at, that we have to, it takes the Auditor General to tell senior staff to do that. You think maybe the minister might be paying a bit more of attention to his department along the way too. Complete offender medical history and security assessments. I mean, how can we expect anything less than the results we've earned when we have this is the type of accountability and leadership we have at the highest levels of government? Are you aware of any similar audits across the, maybe in another province, any similar audits of corrections facilities, and how would, can you, if you are aware of any, is there any sense of how we would stack up?
So we of course we didn't attempt to sort of compare our audit results. It would only be a guess on my part, which I won't make a guess, but I would imagine that others have looked at that. I know just from my federal experience when I was with the federal OAG, I know the Correctional Services Canada. They have a very large internal audit department, and their internal audit department does a lot of work, and they post everything online as well in terms of their audit findings, so lots of stuff there as well. But I can't give you sort of that scorecard of how Nova Scotia compares across the country.
Yeah, in the audit you stated that Nova Scotia is spending $250 per day per offender. Do you have any sense as to how that ranks against other provinces?
Again, we haven't tried to cross-compare that across the country.
Okay. And in the course of your audit, did you come across any statistics on minor drug seizures at our correctional facilities?
So in terms of incidents, we do indicate the incidents that we noted during the period, and there were 4 major drug seizures. Sorry, I'm on page 32 on the summary of incidents. So there was 4 major drug seizures, and it lists a dozen or so incidents that we summarized.
Okay. Thank you for that. For intermittent sentences, you stated that correctional officers face some pressure to process the offenders quickly. Where does that pressure come from?
So I think in I don't know if it's fairness, but in context to the folks that work at corrections. So if you go, as our team did, and I spent, I think, 3 days in adult facilities across the province. If you go to Central, for example, on a Friday evening where they're processing intermittent offenders, you might have 50 people who are coming in for processing, who are there for the weekend. That poses significant challenges to the staff that work there in terms of doing assessments, in terms of getting them checked in terms of looking at the security of these folks, in terms of processing them. So they were quite frank with us that, they're on the receiving end, if you will, at corrections of what happens with intermittent, and we're not questioning whether there should be intermittent sentences. But we do note that these are posing challenges. And if you look across Canada, this is one where the department has statistics, and they would tell you that Nova Scotia has a lot more in terms of percentages of intermittent offenders, intermittent sentences, than many other places across the country. So it's a challenge for them to deal with. Now, having said that, it's their job to deal with it, and we looked at how they're dealing with it.
Yeah, I mean, and you did include a lot of statistics on intermittent sentences in your report, and I think you mentioned that Nova Scotia has anywhere from 2 to 8 times as many as some other intermittent sentences as other jurisdictions. And you shared some very detailed statistics on intermittent sentences here in Nova Scotia. 77% have more than 10 prior convictions. 26% have been incarcerated more than 5 times previously. 86% have been involved in internal incidents during prior periods of incarceration. So there was a lot of statistics there that I won't say seemed out of place, but it got my attention that they were there. What was the reason behind including those statistics on the intermittent sentences?
I think the point is on context and fairness. I would go back to my earlier comment to say, yes, we're looking at how well you're doing the job with the cards you've been dealt with, but the fact is, I think it is important context that if you're dealing with a lot more challenges on the way in terms of dealing with intermittence, it's important that we lay out that context. Having said that, at the end of the day, we reported on what was being done and did you do what you're supposed to be doing and how well were you doing it. But we don't want to lose that sense. I think it's not unlike maintenance enforcement, where we said, you know, you're dealing with 15,000 cases, which is context for people to realize the world this is happening in.
Did the department offer any feedback on those statistics? Did they indicate that they have any sense of whether intermittent sentences are kind of being overused?
Well, I think that's one I'll be careful on in terms of the intermittent sentences, because a lot of this involves the judiciary and the corrections end of it. They deal with what they receive and what they're told to deal with, right? So in terms of, I wouldn't want to leave here today with any kind of thoughts that I'm making a comment on whether there should or shouldn't be intermittent sentences. We have a system that awards those as they deem fit. We have an organization that has to deal with those people. So the department shared to us what that does for them without indicating there should or shouldn't be intermittent sentences, because that would be for somebody else to decide.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for that. In terms of grants and contributions, you've given a recommendation to the Finance and Treasury Board regarding best practices for grant program design, administration, and monitoring. Is the fact that you made the recommendation to the Finance and Treasury Board, is that an indication that you feel the concerns you've raised really extend beyond these three departments in question?
So when we do these audits, obviously, if you have 20 government departments, we can't be everywhere, and we pick 3 to get a good sample. But we hope, 2 things I hope from this. One is that if there are issues in other departments around some of these things, the role of Finance and Treasury Board, they can get some guidance out to everybody so they can learn. Also, I always say I hope the departments that weren't audited here, that were not part of the grants audit, look to these results of this audit and say, yeah, you know what, we're going to do some self-assessment, we're going to take note, and we're going to do something. So I think it was recognizing that there had to be a central function so as to provide this type of learning to all of the departments.
I guess a general question that comes out of some of your audit of the grants and contributions. Is there an acceptable level of discretion for provincial employees? Is there an acceptable level of discretion, and or is discretion sometimes exceeded?
I think and maybe you can help me through the chair. It depends what you mean, I think, by discretion. Now, we do comment that in the design phase, there needs to be more work looked at the risk assessment around the design of the grants. So, for example, you're not doing 100 inspections on a $1,000 grant, but you're doing perhaps 0 inspections on a $500,000 grant with more risk. So if that's what we're talking about in terms of discretion, I think we did say that at the design phase there needs to be a better alignment in terms of looking at the risks around the grants, so you don't get odd situations like that. So in terms of discretion, that's one aspect. Then there's something called discretionary grants, which is a whole other grant type of program that we looked at here as well.
Okay. I guess I'm thinking in the context of, like, if the rules aren't being followed, or the rules are being breached, or the criteria is being breached on so many occasions, is it being breached because the staff thinks the rules are silly, I guess, for lack of a better word? That's what I'm trying to get my head around. Like, when I look at, I'll summarize what I read from this section of the audit, and then I guess maybe you can tell me if I'm being fair or not. There are programs that don't have well-articulated goals. Grants are given to projects that don't meet the application criteria. There are few inspections to determine whether projects were actually finished with the grant money. There's inconsistent means of recouping funds from failed projects. there's little examination of whether the projects ultimately meet the goals of the program, and little examination of whether the program is meeting the goals of the department. Like, that's kind of what I took from this, and it kind of makes me think, well, that's not very good.
So two things I would add to that, if I have the opportunity, I think. You want me to respond? Two things I would add to that is, let's keep in mind that we did conclude that the grants were generally awarded and paid in line with departmental requirements. So I wouldn't want people to leave with a sense of these things aren't being done appropriately. Having said that, is there sloppiness around the management of these grants? Absolutely. Are there things that need to be better done in terms of looking at public expenditures with the concept of evaluation so that you can look to future spending and where you want to spend your money in the future? Absolutely. And I think, you know, the 2 points I would leave you with is we looked at 18 programs, 17 of them did not have measures of success. Also, for 17 of them, the risk to program success were not identified. So
yeah, so that's I guess that's my thing. You looked at 18 projects, 18 programs. Sorry, what percentage of coverage was that? Like, how many programs was there?
So in the programs that we looked at, if you look at the Appendix 2, so we covered about $45 million in these 18 programs that we looked at. In terms of the total, if you look at page 23, we have the total coverage there. So the total grants would have been 127 for 16-17 and 88. So just over around 210 million. We looked at 45 million of 210 million, which I'm comfortable saying as an auditor, that's pretty extensive coverage of the population.
It is, but it isn't. Like, it's in that so 45 million of 200 million, and well, let's face it, the results weren't very good, right? So you don't know what you don't know. But in the rest of that 150 million, I would assume the results would be similar if you went and did it all. So I don't think I would.
Time has expired. Move to the NDP Caucus and the Honourable Dave Wilson.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I want to continue on with the Chapter 2 Justice Correctional Facilities. And I know part of your conclusion was the staff training is not fully completed in accordance with the policy they have set out. And I know noted in 2.19, page 35, you provided a chart of correction officers and then the number of courses. So here, if I'm reading it right, it says there are 2 officers that needed 1 to 2 courses or did not complete 1 or 2 courses, and then 10 officers that did not complete 3 to 5, and 4 officers that did not complete 5 or more. So am I correct to say, so that's a total of 16 officers you identified in the facility that don't have updated courses that are required? Am I reading that right?
Partially, yes, but the key thing missing from that is that 16 is out of the 20 we tested. That's not out of the whole population.
Okay. And what would be the total working population at the correctional centers? That was 16 out of 20 that you looked at. So out of the total.
So the total staff, including everybody, would be 575. But in this case here, this is just looking at 20 correctional officers of new hires.
Excellent. Okay, thank you. So 575 total. And I know, well, I know through my own experience, you know, continuing education is important when you're in a certain field, and that education usually takes place while you're working, which means you're off the duties that you are tasked to do. So, is there any indication that staffing level has played a role in employees obtaining the courses? So, you know, is it, you know, I'm just wondering if that came across the audit on, is there enough staff there, one, to meet the needs of the roles that they have, but two, to meet the needs of ensuring that the staff is properly trained and have to come off maybe their regular duties to obtain the courses that are required through the policies that are set.
So there was no attempt to explain or look at, okay, why this wasn't the case. I mean, the department had said that this was the program that was put in place for these folks to take. This is what they should take. So I think there's probably a good discussion to have with the department, because I think what's most important on that now, we can't change where we've been or where we are. But if they're going to deliver on the responses to the recommendations on the timelines, then your question, I think, is critical to say, if you didn't do it before, you couldn't do it, how are you going to do it now and be able to deliver on that?
Okay, thank you for that. And I noticed under your conclusion, you said many of the policies that promote safety and security not consistently followed. So the programs or did you look at the specific courses that were needed? Do you identify which ones, and I know it could be in here, so did you identify which courses seem to be the ones that are not being followed up on or taken by the employees?
Sure. So there's a couple of examples. So, and if this helps, on the one bucket, if you will, there's the new hires and the people coming in and what training they're taking. And the example we gave there was one of the examples would be the mental health training. The other bucket I would put it on is the expired training and the retraining, which obviously I think is just as important as the other bucket. And some of the examples we use there are we had 16 of 20 correctional officers that we looked at had expired training. 3 examples we used were use of force training that was expired, emergency first aid. There were 7 folks, so it did vary. So it's not only on the new hires, but it's also on the recertification and the retraining of people you have on strength.
And definitely those areas, and I think that you mentioned them under 2.16, understanding and responding to mental illness or equivalent, recognition of emotional disturbed persons, applied suicide intervention skill training is extremely important. Can you indicate if those programs, and I just mentioned 3 of them, deal with any of the support for the correctional officers themselves? So in context, public safety professions across the country have a higher rate of diagnosis of PTSD, for example. And if you look at all the professions, unfortunately, you have professions like paramedics, fire, police, military, and corrections. Corrections has the highest percentage of its workforce that are diagnosed with PTSD. Almost 26% of correctional officers in Canada are diagnosed with PTSD, and it's alarming. A lot of talk and emphasis and light is shone on military, which actually has one of the lower ones in those public safety professions, but corrections is the highest. So, in your audit, did you look at all at what the courses are being delivered? Is that mental safety of the correctional officers themselves, is that part of that program, or is that something I need to dive into with the department?
So we just looked at the courses in terms of the names of them, whether they were required and whether they were taken. So the nature of what's involved in those courses better directed towards the department.
All right, I appreciate that. I just want to go quickly to, and I know I'm going to share my time with my colleague here, to the programming, grants and programming. And I think I heard this early, maybe it was in camera, if not in some of the answers to some of the questions. Is there did you indicate there was 170 grants that are given out, and you audited 18? Did I heard 170 somewhere. I was just trying to put that into context of the 18 or so that you audited.
So we looked at 18 programs, okay, as identified on Appendix 2, where they're summarized, and we did within that, on our sample, our testing, audit lingo, if you will, we looked at 170 payments.
Okay. And would some of those be just, I know you give the list of the 18, would some of those be to small groups? I mean, for us as MLAs, often interested in this audit is these audits that you've presented are important. Maintenance enforcement is one of the things we hear about in the office. But from many groups, we hear from them how to access grants. So did you take into some of those smaller grants that nonprofit organizations apply for through CCH in the audit, or is it just focusing on kind of the overall arts Nova Scotia grants to individuals? Like, how deep did you look into? Did you capture some of those small non-profit organizations?
So part of why we did this audit is we wanted to get at the population of expenditures that were small grants that add up to big numbers as they do here. So for example, look, and it depends what you define as a small amount of money, I guess, but recreational facilities, for example, with $10,000. So, you know, we looked at a number of those, and we gave some examples of issues around those $10,000 ones. In terms of some of the samples around smaller ones, if Ms. Richardson wants to add, to give you an example of some of the smaller than 10.
Ms. Richardson.
So, I mean, not necessarily in terms of dollar value, but I think in terms of what you're talking about in terms of those types of organizations. So we definitely tried to get a cross-section of grants to individuals, grants to not-for-profits. So in terms of not-for-profits, I mean, things like community facility improvement, recreation facilities development, one-time emerging culture and heritage initiatives, operating assistance to cultural organizations. Like, there's lots of programs in there that we looked at those types of grants that you're
reading through the recommendations and that, what I'm trying to get to is to improve on the audit. Is it the department? Did you find that these small organizations weren't providing the information that they needed to? And you know, is it the fix in the department, making sure that those evaluations are done, the checks are done? Because often the small organizations are very small. They're all usually volunteers. I want to make sure that, you know, I know I've seen grant applications from many of them, and they look fulsome and kind of check off all the boxes. So I want to make sure that those organizations aren't the ones that are kind of being critiqued or criticized in the audit. Is it at a department level to make sure that the policies that they have in place for the grants is that kind of where the criticism or the concern is within the audit as a whole?
So the audit was very much looking at the departments and what they do. But I do just want to leave you with a point here, particularly for smaller organizations. Certainly what we're not suggesting or encouraging is more bureaucracy or oversight over a $300 grant. That's not what this is about. And in fact, in some cases, we gave examples where if you look at inspection, for example, you might have more rigorous inspections on smaller dollar amounts where there was no risk assessment to say why you would do that, and then you might get a bigger expenditure dollar value that didn't have the same level of inspection. So we're not saying move everybody to this incredible overlay of oversight and inspection. What we're saying is step back at the beginning, do a risk assessment and say, where are the risks? What do we really need to do in the design of these things, and how do we want to deliver? By the departments, not by the organizations receiving the money.
No, I appreciate that, and I think the organizations do. Many of them run on a shoestring group of volunteers, so I appreciate that clarification. Mr. Chair, I'll pass my time to my colleague.
Ms. Roberts.
Thank you very much. Maybe a last thing, just following along the line of questioning from my colleague. You know, our caucus has raised. Has called for more operating grants for arts and cultural organizations. Right now, there's been a set amount of operating grants, and they've been going to the same organizations for a number of years, which means that, in fact, some small organizations that are doing great work are needing to constantly twist themselves into knots to try to be appearing to present a project proposal for something new or innovative or one time, when in fact that is what you know, getting that project grant will be what keeps the doors open for work that is in fact ongoing and contributing a great amount. I have a number organizations in my own constituency that I have, advocated for and highlighted the great work of. I think of, for example, the Bus Stop Theatre, which, has no operating grant at all from the province at this point, and yet is absolutely essential to the work of many, many other smaller organizations, theatre companies, emerging artists, and without which we would be, in desperate shortage of a venue. So I wonder if there would be any comment on, in an overall way emerging from this audit, on the merit of considering an expansion of operating grants versus project grants.
So decisions around budgeting and how much to spend on grants obviously falls within a government to do. What we're looking at here is controls and effectiveness of how that is managed. I would just point out, information purposes only, that on page 26 where we give the appendix, we do budget versus actual. So if you look at community cultures and heritage for 2017, the budget was about $12 million and they spent about $24 million. So the actual spend by communities, culture and heritage, as an example, was probably double what they had planned. The other two examples were a little bit different, but we gave you the budget versus actual, just in case that was useful information.
Yeah, and I did read in the audit that that some of that overspend was as a result of federal dollars that became available that were required matching provincial funds in order to leverage those. So I think that's a factor there as well. I want to talk about the Access Roads program that is administered by Forest Nova Scotia. As the audit points out, these grants are very small. The payments are small. They're going mostly to small woodlot owners. 90% of the grants go to small woodlot owners, and between the percentage of the grants that go directly to Forest Nova Scotia, in addition to an administrative fee that Forest Nova Scotia charges to the woodlot owners, Forest Nova Scotia gets approximately $163,000 a year in revenue from administering that program, where many of the grants are $3,000 a year. I would just appreciate a comment on the value for money from that approach.
So order. Time has expired. We'll move to the Liberal Caucus and Mr. Jessom.
Thank you, folks. Once again, thanks for affording us the opportunity to ask some questions and for putting together a report that becomes an important part of this process. Back to the first thing this morning, I just would like to clarify some of Ms. Richardson's comments about the different types of grants that were considered. And through the chair, Ms. Richardson, you identified some of the grants that were assessed as discretionary. Could you comment kind of what distinguishes discretionary grants from, I guess, application-based grants or criteria-based grants, and provide the committee with a couple of examples of what discretionary grants would be? Through the chair. Thank you.
Ms. Richardson.
So the discretionary grant funding, and so just to clarify, we looked at discretionary grant funding at communities, culture, and heritage only. And so essentially those grants are grants that don't have specific eligibility criteria. So for a discretionary grant, obviously there's no application form or a standardized assessment process that another program would go through. So in terms of examples, without getting into, I guess, specific examples of some of the ones that we looked at, they varied from anything from, operating assistance to entities in specific years to specific programs or purchases. So they were really quite varied, and just as it says in the report, they also varied in dollar value from, $100 up to $1 million, or in total it was $1 million, sorry. I think that's... Yeah.
Okay, yeah, that's helpful. I guess I'm just trying to understand, like there must be some type of I guess, expression of interest from community group X to suggest that they require this discretionary grant. Is that valid?
So yeah, generally the discretionary grants can come from any avenue. So they could come from within the department, an application or something like that that was received to a program that didn't fit those criteria. It could be direct emails to the minister or other members of the department through publicly available email addresses, that type of thing. So they really can come through any avenue, and that's part of what we also discussed in there in terms of that the discretionary grants are managed across the department, and that's why there's really kind of no standardized documentation and retention standards, is because based on what the grant is, it may be managed anywhere within the department.
Okay, thank you. I'd just like to kind of, I guess, take a little deeper dive into, I just heard it mentioned, Mr. Pickup, that there were several, or there were a group of one-time grants that were included in this assessment, and I'm just wondering, I guess, for my own knowledge, really, kind of how you measure the, I guess, the productivity of a one-time grant versus, you know, an ongoing thing that you would be able to establish a baseline for.
So I think on the one-time grants, you know, similar to an ongoing grant in terms of the principles-based approach, would require that you look at what do you intend to achieve by this expenditure? What would be the measure of success or the outcome? You would define that at the beginning, and then you would look at the risks to managing that. Then after you go through the proper approval process and you spend the money, then you would go back and look to say, what did we achieve for that? So, well, a one-time grant, you know, maybe one time in nature and not a reoccurring type thing. Maybe the program is not going to happen. It still can be worthwhile to go back for two aspects. One, yes, the money is spent, but you know what you got for the money, but also in terms of planning for other types of things. It may identify new areas of expenditure. It may identify differing areas of expenditure, or it may say, keep doing the same thing all over again. So on a principles-based approach, I would say some of the underlying principles are the same, whether it's a one-time grant or whether it is something that is a typical program, something that is ongoing in nature as well. Okay, that's helpful. Thank you. Sticking to grants here, I'm wondering, and as you reiterated in your comments a moment ago, the department in most cases is or groups are maintaining their requirements to the different I guess applications that are presented. I'm wondering, was there any consideration in your audit, or was there any part of your audit that took place that would have dove into, I guess, the specific procedure of administering the grants? I'm thinking from a client services perspective. So in terms of the, you know, the important but more simple administration, if you will, in terms of how the grants were dispersed, for example, going out the door, you know, we found that overall the controls were in place and that was properly occurring. So I think our recommendations really center around looking at what you need in terms of the front end on the risk of a grant to say, what do you want to have in place, whether that is inspection, whether that is administration, whether that is overlay, all of which of course has a cost and a benefit to say, what do you want to happen on that? But in terms of the money going out the door, going to the proper folks, you know, overall no concerns that is not working well. You know, we tested 18 different programs, 170 examples, and found that to be working well. Now, having said that, you know, the administrative practices that you refer to, some room to clean up and tighten some of that. So to be forward-looking, I think, in terms of looking at expenditures going forward.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Pickup. I'll shift gears to maintenance enforcement. Through the chair, there's been, I would say, widespread consideration throughout caucus, and I know consideration given by opposition members as well, that maintenance enforcement is, you know, for a lot of people, a difficult thing to enter into and to go through, and to have to as a client be, you know, kind of be leading the charge versus being served by the organization in terms of, I guess bluntly, getting what you're owed from the person that owes it to you, or owes it to your child, excuse me. So I'm wondering, is there kind of a national average that exists that would pertain to, I guess, the amount of dollars or the number of, or the lack thereof, delinquent cases that exists in the nation? Obviously, the goal is to have 100%, but you know, in trying to get as close to that as possible, is there a national benchmark that exists that, you know, we as a province could match ourselves to, or try to, you know, succeed in getting to that point?
I think that's likely, you know, a very good question for the department in terms of with them setting their performance indicators of where they want to go, future direction. Do they look at practices across Canada? Do they look at results across Canada? And when they do, what does that mean? Right? I mean, because that sometimes is the issue for an auditor, for example. If you do some of that cross-country comparison and, you know, you say, okay, the number is this or that in another province, then what? Right? Would you really, you know, let's say this number was a little bit higher somewhere else. It goes to your point, I think, to your comment to say that doesn't negate your interest in wanting to change that $60 million and make it lower. So, so we haven't gone there in terms of looking at that, but I would suggest that's a very relevant question for the department, and how they incorporate that into their goal setting and objective setting and indicator setting in terms of determining where they want to be and when.
Okay, thank you. I've dealt with a number of these files in my office, as I know all members likely have, and like, they're truly very difficult circumstances, and by no means am I trying to get away from, you know, the primary goal of positive customer service and making sure that we enforce and, you know, the children that expect and deserve and require these monies are able to get that. Just bear with me here, excuse me. On to just keeping with maintenance enforcement. We talk about the ongoing monitoring of a client's file, and perhaps there being some gaps in time that a given file is revisited. Stepping aside from that and looking at the enforcement side of it specifically, was there any type of assessment done in regards to, is maintenance enforcement consistently exhausting their full capacity of enforcing court orders?
So the first step and thank you for that chance to explain. The first step in that, I think, is very much what you alluded to in terms of bringing the files forward in terms of looking at potential enforcement actions. So firstly, you got to look at a file, I guess, to know whether you want to do A, B, C, or D, all the above or none of the above. And some of the examples that we gave in terms of the 25 cases that we looked at, where the files weren't being brought forward to consider enforcement actions to start with, right? So if you're not bringing those files forward, you're not even getting into that B part of the discussion to say, should you do this, this, or this in terms of the actions that you want to take. So I think that is an important aspect, and, it will always sort of stay with me from this audit, I think, in terms of not using that function that, when I was younger, we used to call BF, bring forward the file, right? It's sort of an electronic system of making sure the files are flagged, brought out to your attention to say, consider it's been X period of time, let's look at this file, and let's see if we want to do A, B, C, and D. So you've got to do that first step in order to be able to do the next step to say, what actions should we actually take? And what then you're into then a question of the efficacy of those actions to say, okay, you did the first step, then you decided to do A, B, C, or D. Now what happened as a result of doing A, B, or C, or D? Did it actually impact the outstanding payments and the amounts that are owed? So it's all very interrelated.
Okay, thank you. I hear what you're saying, and that certainly makes a lot of sense. I would add, and my colleague kind of touched on it, that there's been, a consciousness and a national agenda to address issues with respect to maintenance enforcement, and provincially we've enabled more capacity through legislation. This year compared to last, the number of maintenance activities that have taken place have increased to the tune of 19% more than last fiscal. I don't say that to belittle the significance of trying to meet that 100% goal, but I think that it's important to note with respect to government's appetite to try and improve the way that we serve clients that are accessing this maintenance enforcement program. I guess I would just jump.
Order. I'm sorry, time has expired. Time for questions has expired. Mr. Pickup, would you like to provide some closing comments?
And I do, and I will be brief. So I want to thank you for your questions. Thank you for your interest in our work. We have, as you can probably tell, a lot of respect for this committee. We serve the House, we report to the House, but we very much look to you as one of our main contacts, our key points in terms of interacting with the House. The Public Accounts Committee we view as a key aspect of promoting accountability. Yes, it's the departments, it's the organizations we audit that have responsibility to do something with the results, but I think you folks play a key role, and I think, to your credit, and I would encourage you to keep with it as a committee, that I think partially the 75% completion rate that we saw this year is a reflection of your role as too. So I would respectfully encourage you to keep calling in these organizations on our audits to discuss the result. I would also again thank the people with me today, but equally important, if not more, is all the folks who work with the folks with me today to do these audits. There are 35 very committed people in the office, and that goes from the person you see when you enter the door through to the people you see with me today. So I have the easy job of coming to answer questions on the work that they do, but it's these folks that do all the hard work. So I thank them for that. Looking forward forward. Our next report won't be until the financial report in October. We're busy now doing all the financial audits over the summer. We put down our performance tools for the most part and work on the financial audits, the government financial statement audit. I also want to thank, and I know I did at the beginning, but the organizations that we audit. Again, I would stress, you know, there is no disagreement or argument with the people that we audit, and I can't say that enough to say we're not in a position where we're trying to push to get someone to agree that something has to be done. You know, I met with the Minister of Justice this week to talk about his 2 audits and to talk about the 2 departments, and you know, we had a great discussion, and I'm impressed by, you know, with him and the deputy in terms of ownership of these issues and the commitment to do something. And I certainly don't mind sharing with you that I shared with them that I really hope the committee would get the deputy in here sooner rather than later. I think to assure Nova Scotians what is happening on these files because of the amount of time that has gone by since we did the audit. So I will leave it at that, and thank you again.
Thank you, Mr. Pickup, and thank you to your staff with you here today and those back at the office for your work. We have some committee business. We have correspondence from the Department of Transportation Infrastructure Renewal, information requested from the March 28th meeting, from Health and Wellness, information requested from the April 25th meeting, and from the Department of Business, information requested from the April 18th meeting. Are there any questions on that correspondence? Just one small note. I want to ask members to ensure that no one takes photographs during our meetings. The only people permitted to take photographs during our meetings are the media. So I put that out as a reminder to remind everyone about that. Our next meeting date is June the 6th, and that will be with the Department of Business. The subject is the Rural Internet Middle Mile Project. And with that, is there further business to come before the committee? Mr. Houston.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. You noted the next meeting is June 6th, Rural Internet. I note that the next meeting after that is not till September 12th. That's a long gap between meetings, and even after September 12th, we have meetings scheduled up to almost mid-October. So I'm conscious of the Auditor General's comments that we should get the departments that were the subject of this audit to appear before the committee sooner rather than later, I think was the way the Auditor General phrased it. And so given that we do have, I know the normal process would be for a subcommittee to make recommendations to the whole committee and then schedule after that. But in the interest of time, I'd suggest that since we have open dates, June 13th, June 27th, and maybe July 4th, I'd like to make a motion to this committee while the whole committee is here that we fill those dates and honor the request of the staff to get these departments in sooner rather than later, and we bring them in on June 13th, June 27th, and July 4th. We have public accounts meetings, and we fill each one of those weeks with one of the topics from this Auditor General's report that's been the subject here. So I'd like to make that motion.
Any comments on the motion? Mr. Gordon Wilson.
Thank you. You know, it was encouraging to hear the comments of the AG regarding to how impressed he was that there was no agreement with the recommendations that were brought forward. You know, we have a 75% completion on recommendations, and you know, I think we're all really pleased to see the response of government to these recommendations. We have a very, I think, formal agenda setting process. We all have, you know, our schedules that we try to work around, and I respect also the clerk's schedule on scheduling these meetings. Just for the record, you know, we meet on average far more, actually double the amount of public accounts committees in Canada, as the best one that would be behind us is only half the amount of time that we meet. And, you know, I feel at some point in time, certainly it wouldn't be out of the question to have them in here, but at this point in time, I think I'd like to respect the schedule that we have set for the committee and go forward from there.
Mr. Roberts?
Just further to Mr. Houston's motion, we are starting an out-of-town caucus meeting on the 20th, but the 20th is largely a travel day, and we could actually be here for public accounts from 9 to 11 and then travel immediately after that. To follow up on Mr. Gordon Wilson's comment, I'm still relatively new at this and relatively new at kind of comparing our the way we do things here with other jurisdictions, but many other jurisdictions actually have much longer legislative sessions so that there's continual discussion in the House, whereas here in Nova Scotia, as I understand it, yes, our Public Accounts Committee meets more frequently than some others, but our legislative sessions are relatively short when there's an opportunity to be actually asking the ministers questions about their department. So for that reason, I would certainly welcome, particularly given the seriousness of the comments related to justice, getting those in.
Okay, we have about 90 seconds remaining in the meeting. Mr. Houston, would you like to formalize the motion?
Yes, thank you. The motion is that the Public Accounts Committee meet on June 13th, June 20th, and June 27th to address these three topics of the Auditor General's report in a timely fashion.
All those in favor of the motion signify by saying aye. Aye. Those opposed? Nay. Motion is defeated. We are just about out of time, so there is not really time for any further business before the committee. So with that, we will adjourn, and our next meeting is on June 6th with the Department of Business to discuss Rural Internet Middle Mile Project. This meeting is adjourned.